Madam President, I rise today in support of Finland and Sweden's application to join NATO. I give my strong support to this application. I disagree heartily with our colleague from Missouri. I know you know, Madam President, having worked on this issue, as I have, having visited these countries, we know how important they are to Minnesota and Wisconsin. Minnesota has a special bond with the Kingdom of Sweden and the Republic of Finland. And at the core of this bond, at the core of the bond between our country and these countries is shared values, values of democracy, values of freedom. And yes, we have challenges. Of course we do in Asia. But I happen to believe when you are a great power like the United States of America, you can do two things at once. And let's look at what these countries add to our security by joining NATO. First of all, Finland is over 2% of their budget on military. Sweden is increasing their budget on military. Both nations have professional militaries. They have strong and transparent economies, and mostly they believe in human rights, in freedom, in liberty, and equality. They believe in democracy. And I will note specifically, Finland has added an extra $2.2 billion in defense spending this year. And Greece and Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and Slovakia and Croatia, United Kingdom, above 2%. So let's get the facts straight here. And let's talk about what these countries will add to our security. We are at an unparalleled moment in history. Since Vladimir Putin's cruel, unjustified invasion of Ukraine, people all over the world have been waking up out of a 2-year plague, out of a slumber, to realize just how fragile our democracy is. We realized it here in this building when not so long ago insurrectionists invaded this chamber. We didn't just sit back and say, well, there goes our democracy. We stood up. We stood up, Democrats and Republicans, in this very chamber. And when President Zelensky of Ukraine took to the streets the minute that this invasion started and looked at a video camera and said, "We are here," he was saying that to his own people, to give them the courage to stand up against the inhuman barbarism of a dictator. But he was also saying it to the rest of the world. We see it on Ukraine's front lines, where every day people took up arms and are taking up arms to protect their country. It sent a warning shot to tyrants around the world who believe that free democracies are just up for grabs. Ukrainians have shown their true colors in bright blue and yellow, which just happen to be the colors of Sweden. They have shown their true colors, and they are showing the world what courage is all about. Having been in the last group of senators from these chambers who met with leaders in Ukraine just a few weeks before the war started, I can tell you this: the people of Ukraine want to choose their own destiny, and the moral flame they have lit across the world will not be doused. Russia's unprovoked aggression in Ukraine has changed how we think about the world's security. That's why I strongly support the decision of these two great democracies, Sweden and Finland, to join the most important and defensive alliance in the world, NATO. When President Biden met in May with Finnish and Swedish leaders about their application to join NATO, he said the people of Sweden and Finland, he said to them that we have and they have the full, total, and complete backing of the United States of America. We supported that. The Senate Committee on Foreign Relations echoed its support with an overwhelming bipartisan vote just last month. Our leaders support this pact. By joining NATO, allies made a sacred commitment to one another that an attack on one is an attack on all. The only time in history this has been evoked was after 9/11, when the United States was attacked, and all our allies rallied to our side. As Americans, we have never and will never forget that. In June, we celebrated the anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. NATO was formed in the wreckage of World War II when President Truman signed the North Atlantic Treaty. He expressed the goal of its founders to preserve their present peaceful situation and to protect it in the future. And for decades, it has been crucial to upholding that peace. Now, 73 years later, NATO is as important as ever, and the recent decisions made by our great friends, the great countries of Sweden and Finland, are a testament to the continued promise of this alliance. As Swedish Prime Minister Andersson said in May, with Sweden and Finland as members, NATO will also be stronger. We are security providers with sophisticated defense capabilities, and that is correct. We are champions of freedom, democracy, and human rights. That is correct. As Finland's leaders, President Niinisto and President Marin also said, NATO membership would strengthen Finland's security. As a member of NATO, Finland would strengthen the entire defense alliance. I had the honor of being on a panel at the Munich Security Conference with President Niinisto, and I saw firsthand his commitment to the democracy in Finland and to the democracy all over the world. Finland and Sweden are already among our closest partners on a range of issues. They are already important contributors to the international community, including in the United Nations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and other international organizations. Finnish and Swedish troops have already served shoulder to shoulder with US and NATO forces in Kosovo, in Bosnia. In 1994, Sweden and Finland joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program, strengthening our official relationship and coming one step closer to being a full-fledged NATO member. NATO, Finland, and Sweden have partnered together on security in the Baltic Sea region through regular conversations and exercises, a practice that will be even more important now. And in 2018, Finland, Sweden, and the US signed a trilateral agreement to deepen defense cooperation and promote security in Northern Europe. Both Finland and Sweden are already working in coordination with the US and other allies and partners to support brave Ukrainians standing up to Vladimir Putin. Sweden has responded to Russian bombing of maternity hospitals with millions of dollars of support and helmets and body shields, as well as billions for the refugees flowing from Ukraine. Finland has sent military aid, including thousands of assault rifles and 70,000 ration packages, and has offered millions of dollars in humanitarian aid. Both nations also have the potential, as I noted, to bring huge assets to this alliance, not, as my colleague from Missouri implied, to somehow make things harder. Are you kidding? Maybe he hasn't seen these countries. I have. Finland, after fighting its own territorial wars with the Soviet Union, has a reserve force of 900,000 strong. Sweden has built its own fighter jets, and both countries recently announced upcoming expansion and reform of their militaries. As the Arctic region, which holds increasing importance for the US and European security, sees encroachments from Russia and China, may I add to my colleague from Missouri, Sweden and Finland are poised to help NATO confront these challenges. I am here to give my full support for Sweden and Finland entering NATO. As we make clear, we stand with Sweden, we stand with Finland, and we stand with democracy. Russia's war in Ukraine, a full-scale, unprovoked, and premeditated war against a sovereign and democratic country, has changed Europe and the world. But it has also demonstrated the importance and resilience of our transatlantic alliance. We have all witnessed the bravery of the Ukrainian people as they fight for their lives, and we are proud to stand with them. This is about the future of political freedom, economic freedom, technological freedom, and yes, democratic freedom. Finland and Sweden taking the step of NATO membership will not only strengthen their own security, but the cause of freedom in Europe and around the world. And I would say, when things are tough, we keep our friends closer. And I believe that this strong NATO and the inclusion of Sweden and Finland will actually help us with the rest of the world, not just with this conflict in Ukraine. And so I ask my colleague from Missouri, who is not here right now, to consider that. As we look at our alliances and how we deal with China, we must strengthen our trade alliances. We must strengthen our military alliances, and certainly including Finland and Sweden as a member of NATO.
My amendment, HEN 22775. As we have discussed previously in this hearing, censorship is becoming more and more blatant on the internet. Big tech is more and more naked in silencing the voices with which they disagree. This bill, if it's enacted, would create an exemption from the antitrust laws to allow big tech to sit down with an enormous conglomerate of media operations and negotiate free from the antitrust laws. This amendment is very simple. It says if you're negotiating, you ought to be negotiating on the ostensible harm that this bill is directed at, which is the inability to get revenues from your content. You should not be negotiated on content moderation and how you're going to censor substantive content. So this bill simply says the topic of discussion when the two sides get together can't be censorship. It should be ad revenues, which is what all of the discussion of this markup has focused on, that if they do engage in collusion of two cartels getting together and engaging in blanket censorship, that does not fall within the protection of this bill. And I would urge the adoption of this amendment.
Thank you. Senator Cruz's amendment would eliminate the exemption from the antitrust laws if anyone is involved in the joint negotiation even discusses content moderation. The bill is not about content moderation. I said this in response to Senator Padilla this morning, coming from a different angle, say it to you today. In fact, the bill actually includes several provisions to ensure that the bill is content neutral. The bill requires payment for content that is already being accessed by the dominant platforms. It does not require or implicate display of content in any way. The bill does not require a platform to carry any content at all.
But Senator Klobuchar, if I could inquire and clarify, you're right, the bill does not require that the cartel sitting down negotiating censor. But without this amendment, the cartel would give an immunity from antitrust liability for the cartel sitting down agreeing to censor. And so whether or not that is your principal objective, it would be a subsidy for censorship from the United States Congress. And as I noted, you in all likelihood have the votes to move this out of committee, but I do not believe this will move on the floor if the answer is that this committee is fine with giving a blanket exception from legal liability for explicit censorship and silencing of voices that the big tech oligarchs disagree with.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
Senator Kennedy.
Ted, let me be sure I understand what your amendment does, because you have two that are very similar. What you're saying is that when you sit down and negotiate, you're just negotiating over price, over money.
Right.
If somebody from social media said, look, I can give you a better price if you would work with me more on changing your content.
Or it doesn't even have to be connected to price. If they sit down and say, let's all agree to come together and silence the following voices. Without this amendment, that there would be no antitrust liability for that collusion of a cartel. Otherwise, there would arguably be antitrust liability.
I don't have any problem with that.
Senator Kennedy, I'm sorry. This amendment essentially gives platforms a get-out-of-jail-free card by presenting an obvious opportunity for gamemanship in the negotiation.
But I don't understand why.
Since news outlets depend on the antitrust exemption, while the covered platforms do not, the platforms could then raise content moderation at the first opportunity in an attempt to avoid the joint negotiations. So.
Well, no one faces liability for the conduct of others, and what this amendment would do is it would say when the cartels sit down and negotiate, they'd say, we're not going to discuss censorship, we're going to discuss price. And, you know, under your theory, by the way, I have another amendment to eliminate Section 230 immunity for censorship too. So we could solve the big tech problem on that side too if we wanted to. But there's no argument that the newspapers would suddenly be liable because Google walked in and screamed censorship. Like, you're only liable for your own conduct, and this simply says if your conduct extends to censorship, there's not an immunity from this bill for that activity.
As I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman,
Yes, I'm
it's okay if I talk?
Yes, Senator Kennedy.
As I appreciate it, Senator Cruz and Senator Klobuchar, what it's saying is that the only issue on the table in the negotiations and the arbitration is the amount, if any, that social media will pay for the content, creative content produced by the newspaper. That if somebody walks in here and into the negotiations and winks and says, I can give you a better price here, but I sure don't like your politics, they can't do that.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Senator Kennedy, we've worked on this for months, and we won't be able to support the Cruz amendment here. So I'm hoping we could talk about this in the future, but if this is in it, we can't support the bill.
Well, I guess, first, this is a new experience. We actually have democracy in action where we have a debate here. And I don't understand why. I mean, I just, to me, the issue is supposed to be about money and not about moderating content. I mean, this just makes it explicit what I thought was implicit in the bill. If I'm missing something, tell me.
Senator Grassley, for holding this important hearing. When I was a DA in Hennepin County, our biggest county, when I first got there, we had rampant carjacking. We made major focus on this. Back then, it was bait cars. It was more, of course, cars being stolen from the street, but oftentimes there are also people in them, and I'm committed to making a change here. I thought it was interesting what you talked about, Mr. Glaw, which makes some sense to me. About everything you guys said made sense, but I want to start with this, with the organized crime, and this idea that some of this is just, you know, people doing this for the fun of it, with people dead as a result, but some of it is because of the high demand for vehicles, and they're taking these cars. And would that make you lead more to a federal response and the need for coordination with the FBI, U.S. Attorney's Office, and such?
Senator, thank you for the question. And fortunately, NICB is postured. That's what we do. And we actually have two former U.S. attorneys that are on my staff here today with us. We have aggressively postured with the FBI, Homeland Security investigations, and state and local law enforcement, exactly what you're talking about. The demand for cars right now is at an all-time high in the United States, up 39%. You can barely get a car when you go into a lot. And it has created a market for criminal organizations, especially if they don't actually commit a robbery, a violent crime. These are property crimes. And we have seen a tremendous uptick in the United States since 2019, a 16% increase in auto theft. But just the numbers on auto theft, Colorado has seen a 79% increase in auto theft, Wisconsin 74%, Vermont 64%, New York 59%, DC 52%.
Yep, I know.
Yeah.
Could I give you my numbers?
Sure.
Minneapolis alone, this is one city, saw a 537% increase in carjackings between 2019 and 2020. In 2021, there were more than 640 successful or attempted carjackings in one city. That is not so different than what you're seeing by the numbers in Cook County. Sheriff, it's very similar with the percentages where you've seen carjacking spike nearly threefold. I want to go to a different topic here with you, Chief Garcia, and that would be about, in general, supporting the police and the need to with the morale issue and the like. I've led bipartisan legislation for years with Senator Murkowski, Coons, Tillis about reauthorizing the COPS program. Could you talk about how that helps local law enforcement?
Absolutely. Having that support from the COPS office and the COPS program, not only for the programs that we want to do and institute with regards to looking at ways, if you remember the old weed and seed programs that we would have prior. I was a big weed and seed back in the early 90s when I started this, and we kind of had a resurgence of it in the city of Dallas with the terminology and using that. But having those resources, helping resources and getting officers on the street, doing both proactive policing as well as community engagement is crucial and critical. more police officers in law enforcement agencies, if you have a plan, reduces violent crime.
If you have a plan.
Yes, ma'am.
I agree. Mr. Herdman, in early February, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota brought federal charges against a group of 7 men for violent crimes, including carjacking. These cases were being prosecuted as part of the joint federal, state, and local Project Safe Neighborhoods, which is, as you know, a federal initiative led by U.S. attorneys. How does partnering with local and state law enforcement agencies act as a force multiplier for the U.S. attorney's offices?
Thank you for the question, Senator Klobuchar. The federal agencies, they operate most effectively, in my experience, when they actually are present in the police departments. When you have ATF agents and FBI agents who show up and work hand in hand on the same shifts with patrol officers, I think that that's a very effective way to demonstrate a message not only to the police officers in the big city department, but I think also to the community. And so I would suspect that that's what was going on with the Violent Crime Task Force in Minneapolis. I would hope so, because you do see it's daily coordination and hourly coordination as opposed to on a quarterly basis or a biannual basis. It's much more frequent and I think much more effective that way.
So you would agree that it's important to have a U.S. attorney in place, regardless of their political party, have someone in place running these offices?
I'm aware of the candidate who's been nominated. He's my partner at Jones Day, Mr. Lugar.
Are you kidding? I didn't know that.
And I will say I'm on the record, I think, with respect to Mr. Lugar, he's superbly qualified.
Thank you. And as you should all know, that Mr. Lugar was the U.S. attorney at the end of President Obama's term. Actually, the Justice Department under Donald Trump, he was one of 2 people they were considering having stayed on. He decided to go another route, and now he's ready to come back. He has strong support from Republican leaders that people on this side of the dais know. We haven't had problems with Andy Lugar from most of the Republican senators. This is a crusade of Tom Cotton's, who is not just holding up Mr. Lugar, he's holding up a number of other U.S. attorneys and marshals. And I've got a situation in my state, and he's not here right now, where we have 2 retired police chiefs in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Like many jurisdictions, we don't have enough police right now. And Andy Lugar has vast experience and is willing to take on this carjacking issue. But Tom Cotton has decided, because of his opposition to something happening in another state, that he is holding up my U.S. attorney. And I have had it. And if he wants to be on the side of carjackers, go ahead. But we need leadership. This is not just a state and local issue. This is an organized crime issue, as Mr. Glaw has pointed out. This is an issue that goes beyond little local jurisdictions and one neighborhood's cop. It is about the cops doing their jobs, but it is also about taking on these cases in a big, big way. None of you have much to do with this. I cannot believe you're at the same law firm, Mr. Herdman. I did not know that. But I would really appreciate my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talking to Mr. Cotton to find some way to resolve this in the next week, because I am not going to give this up. You cannot hold up the U.S. attorneys who have no serious objections, with support from Republicans, just to make a case, because you want to get attention nationally. Thank you.
I might add that the U.S. Marshal for the Northern District of Illinois is also on Senator Cotton's list. Senator?
The Marshal in the state of Minnesota.
I first want to thank my colleague from the state of Washington, Senator Cantwell, for her passion for the people and the rights of people to vote, and her willingness to actually go through the details of the groups outside of this Congress that feel so strongly about this, including businesses, as pointed out, who understand that you can't do business overseas, having just come back from Ukraine, that I just arrived an hour ago, and uphold democracies overseas if we are allowing our democracy to go to shambles by allowing voter suppression laws to pass as they have in numerous states across the country. Just this week, we marked the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And today, we are considering legislation that goes to the very heartbeat of the democracy, the freedom to vote, that so many have fought and died for. We're here because a flood of state laws to roll back voting has surged up since the 2020 elections, and when
in the 2020 elections, in the middle of a pandemic. Americans cast a ballot, more of them cast a ballot than ever before. They were willing to take those risks, and the laws were changed in red states and blue states and purple states to allow them to do that. But now what do we see? A rollback. A rollback in the presiding officer's great state of Wisconsin. We see rollbacks attempted across the nation in places like Montana, same-day registration in place for 15 years. 8,000 people took avail of it in the last election to either change their address or register that way. So then what happens? Well, say the Republican legislature in Montana, why don't we get rid of something we've had in place for 15 years? Why don't we do that? Guess what that creates, my friends? Maximum confusion and ultimate voter suppression. With that core freedom of voting now at stake, it is on us to stand up, to take up the torch that Dr. King and so many brave Americans carried decades ago and act to preserve the foundational right of our democracy. And while that may sound like an ambitious task, it is one within our reach. By passing the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, we can meet these challenges and turn back the tide. Today, I want to address a topic that has loomed large over this historic debate, and that has to do with the very rules of this chamber. This week, every member of the Senate will have a chance to cast a vote that will determine if this is a legislative body that will rise to meet a test. The test is participation and voting. The test is actually being able to take on the issues of our day. It won't be the first time. Indeed, 4 times already this Congress, our Republican colleagues have blocked us from even considering legislation to protect the freedom to vote. But we're here again this week. We're here because, to quote Ella Baker, a granddaughter of slaves from Virginia who worked alongside some of the great leaders of the civil rights movement, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. So while much has been made of our colleagues who have not committed to join us in this effort to change the Senate rules, we must remain steadfast in the truth that the right to vote in this country is not negotiable. We must forge ahead. I want to start by responding to some of the points that have been raised as reasons not to move forward with legislation at this watershed moment, as reason not to do what it takes to come to protecting the most sacred of rights, the right to vote. Some have argued that allowing voting rights legislation to pass the Senate without clearing a 60-vote threshold would be a mistake that would open the door to somehow leading to wild swings in federal policy. I'm trying to imagine this place ever involved in such a thing, given how slowly we go and how many people understandably want to make sure we're careful in how we pass laws, but that's one of the things that has been raised for why we need some kind of a 60-vote threshold, which of course is not in the Constitution. The word filibuster or cloture, not in the Constitution. And in fact, legislatures across this land, some of whom do very good things, do not use a 60-vote threshold. In fact, democracies across the world do not use a 60-vote threshold. The truth is this: we have tried for months to persuade our Republican colleagues to join us in supporting legislation, to work with us, to debate it. But what they do is they throw a wrench into the process and then basically walk out that door and go home. We don't have that debate that allows us to have amendments and allows us to ultimately have a vote on the bill. It is cut off from a vote. When you look at the past when it comes to voting rights, it has been bipartisan not even that long ago. But this time, even reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, something that has been law of the land, supported on a bipartisan basis, that the President of the United States pointed out when he was in Atlanta, this time, no. Only one Republican, Senator Murkowski of Alaska, was willing even to allow the John Lewis bill to come up for a vote. But if our colleagues across the aisle will not work with us, it cannot mean that we should simply give up. A simple look at history makes that clear. As Representative Clyburn has noted in recent weeks, there have been moments in our history when this most fundamental of rights has not been extended or defended on a bipartisan basis. That's a right to have these bills come up. He pointed to the 15th Amendment that, as he said, was a single-party vote that gave black people the right to vote. And that fact does not make the 15th Amendment any less legitimate. I would also say to my colleagues that the real threat facing our country isn't too much legislation, it's the gridlock and the stalemate in which this chamber is stuck. A number of us were just in Ukraine, standing up for democracy, standing up for the right of people across the world to be able to debate issues and make decisions on the most pressing issues of this time. And now we are back here in this chamber. And we have to have that opportunity as well. This misses another key point in the arguments made against changing the rules. When politicians actually have to vote on stuff, voters can hold them accountable for these votes. We know that the policies in the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act enjoy strong support among the American people. They've been adopted in red and blue and purple states. Look at places like Utah. For years, mail-in balloting. Yet in other states, sadly, it's really hard to do. In other states, you have to get a notary just to get an application, or you have to get a witness just to get an application, even if you have COVID and you're in a hospital. But yet, in many states, red, blue, purple, this is in place. We believe, those of us that support the Freedom to Vote Act, that in keeping with the Constitution that says that Congress can make or alter the laws regarding federal elections, that this should be the law of the land. It is constitutionally supported, and Americans, no matter what their zip code, should have the right to vote in a safe way that's best for them. Arguing the Senate rules are more important than the right to vote ignores the very history of this nation. As Senator Angus King has reminded us, in 1890, Henry Cabot Lodge introduced a bill to ensure African Americans in the South were not disenfranchised. The bill passed the House, but was blocked by the Senate with a filibuster. Lodge argued that the Senate should get rid of the filibuster, saying, "To vote without debating is perilous, but to debate and never vote is imbecile." I think that kind of says it all quite directly. The Senate chose not to change its rules, and due to repeated filibusters in the years that followed, Congress couldn't pass legislation to enforce the 15th Amendment until nearly 70 years later through the Civil Rights Act of 1957. We've also heard that allowing one party to insist on virtually unlimited debates so you can't vote is an essential part of the Senate. But experts from both parties have said this isn't true. As Marty Gold, a respected expert on the Senate rules who worked for Republican leader Howard Baker and was staff director of the Senate Rules Committee, has written, the possibility that a minority of senators could hold unlimited debate on a topic against the majority's will was unknown in the first Senate. Those are his words. Others have argued that requiring a supermajority, as this filibuster does now, to pass legislation was an intentional effort to foster compromise. But again, the historical record simply doesn't back that up. The Constitutional Convention heard but did not adopt a proposal to require a supermajority for legislation. The framers explicitly decided to reserve supermajority requirements for things like constitutional amendments, treaties, and impeachment. To quote one of them, Benjamin Franklin wrote that a system where the minority overpowers the majority would be contrary to the common practice of assemblies in all countries and ages. Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to James Madison, "It is my principle that the will of the majority should always prevail." James Madison was a fierce defender of minority rights, but in 1834, even he wrote, "The vital principle of Republican government is the will of the majority." Listening to those words, does it really seem like the framers of our Constitution envisioned a system where a minority of senators could stand in the way of legislation and stop it altogether, stop the vote, stop the consideration, throw a wrench into a process, take it off the rails, and then just walk out the door and go home? That is not what they envisioned. I also want to be clear. Updating the Senate rules to meet the needs of this moment isn't some radical break with past precedent. Throughout the Senate's history, when faced with unrelenting obstruction from the minority, the majority has in fact changed the Senate rules to allow matters to conclude, to be voted on, not to hang in abeyance in perpetuity. In fact, since it was first established in 1917, the cloture rule has been revised multiple times to make it easier to end debate and to force a vote. Now, for friends watching at home, this is what it means. A cloture motion is what allows senators to bring something to a vote. And under the current rules, it takes 60 senators to open debate to pass a bill. Here are some examples of how the cloture rule has changed over time. In 1949, cloture was extended to cover all issues pending before the Senate, not just bills. In 1975, the vote threshold for cloture was reduced to 3/5 of all senators. In 1979, total post-cloture debate was limited to 100 hours, and then it was limited again to 30 hours in 1986. And in the past decade, the cloture rule has been further reduced for various kinds of nominees, most recently by our Republican colleagues across the aisle. This isn't something from 100 years ago. This isn't something from before we had cars and people were arriving here on horseback. This just happened. In addition to changes to the cloture rule itself, the Senate has put in place exceptions to the rule. In fact, over time, the Senate has established over 160 processes in statute that allow a final vote without requiring 60 votes for cloture to end debate. In other words, you get to a vote without the 60 votes. As a result, we have expedited procedures, including, get this, reconciliation to pass spending and tax legislation, the Congressional Review Act to block regulations, disapproval of arms sales. I guess someone decided that was okay to do for less than 60 votes. Even approving compensation plans for commercial space accidents doesn't require 60 votes, my friends. But while the 60-vote threshold was carved up 160 times so senators could pass things like tax cuts under President Trump, block regulations, and confirm Supreme Court justices, when it comes to voting rights, we are told that traditions and comedy means that we should hug it tight, this old rule, throw voters under the Senate desk, and go home. It's no wonder that our Republican colleagues' support for the 60-vote threshold rings hollow when their priorities, such as tax cuts, such as a Supreme Court nominee, can be passed with a simple majority. Time and time again, the majority in the U.S. Senate has had to change the rules to help pass major legislation. As Senator Merkley has noted time and time again, bills we have passed after the majority has modified the rules include the Natural Gas Policy Act in 1977, funding for the Selective Service System in 1980, deficit reduction legislation in 1985, a moratorium on listing new species under the Endangered Species Act in 1995, and a change made by the majority in 1996 to the reconciliation process, which paved the way for the 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts and 2017 Trump tax cuts. When circumstances change, senators have changed the rules time and time again. All of this history clearly shows that the Senate rules are not chiseled in stone. That's probably a good thing, because we get that the people out there need us to do our jobs, and that maybe that's more important than some archaic rule that someone is now abusing. They are not an outside force, these rules, over which we have no control. They are our rules, the senators' rules, yes, but also the people's rules, written and changed over the years by senators representing the people of this country, just like the ones sitting in this chamber today. As we move forward, I want to make clear that I agree with my colleagues who have said we must keep the history of this institution in mind. By the way, I just gave you the history of this institution. 160 carve-outs, time and time again when the rules have changed. That is the true history of this institution. History plainly allows for just the type of action that our democracy now demands. If we acknowledge the stakes when it comes to protecting the freedom to vote, the cornerstone of our democracy, and we acknowledge the history of the rules of this body, I am left with a simple conclusion. We must update, change, and improve our rules to restore the Senate and meet the moment of our times. Our nation was founded on the ideals of democracy, and we've seen for ourselves in this building how we can't afford to take that for granted. I certainly saw that this weekend in Ukraine. We cannot afford to take any democracy for granted. The world is watching us, watching to see how America is taking on the challenges of the 21st century, including the threats to our democracy. Around the globe, there are those who see weakness in our opportunity. They see it, weakness in our democracy, as an opportunity for them. Those who are hoping that gridlock and paralysis are the defining features of America. They are out there, and you can imagine what world leaders I am thinking of right now. To put it simply, if we're going to effectively compete with the rest of the world, we need a Senate that can do more than just respond to crises. We're pretty good at that. Tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, tsunamis, financial crises, pandemics. Okay, we respond to that. But what about those long-term challenges, like slowly but surely eroding this democracy with voter suppression? There is so much at stake here. We must get this done. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
We are here today to fight for California's governor, to fight for Gavin Newsom. Governor Newsom fights for opportunity for all Californians. Voting no means women are respected, children are protected, and our planet is defended. Are you ready to get in this fight? Then let's get this done. Stop the Republican recall. Vote no. Vote no. Vote no.
Hi, friends in California. September 14th, that's the day. Vote no on this recall. If you care about the fires raging across this state and want to have a governor that's going to do something about climate change, that's Gavin Newsom. If you care about continuing our recovery and turning the corner on this pandemic and all the good work's been done in California getting the vaccine, vote no on the recall. And if you care about a woman's right to choose and not going down the path that we just saw happen in Texas or we've seen in other states across the country, vote no on the recall. 9 more days. Get it done.